So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it. Because I think the idea of eternal conscious torment and kind of the traditional notions about hell are problematic. And one of the reasons that Latter-day Saint theology is attractive to me is because I think it resolves it. But what do you see as the problem with that idea of eternal conscious torment?
Well, it's just straightforwardly incompatible with theism. I mean, like, if you believe what's traditionally said about God, that he's like perfectly loving, that he's just and merciful and good, and then you say, oh yeah, and like the majority of people are going to be in some state of torment, like for all of time, you start to try to work out how that might happen, and it just never coheres. Like like you have to start saying some incredibly silly things, and this has been pointed out very effectively by Christians. Like David Bentley Hart, who's written very convincingly about this, and I just think he's totally right that the people like me who have seen like the absurdity of eternal conscious torment and how it can't possibly be true with theism also being true. It's not that we're like geniuses. It's that it's just so obvious. It is just so it takes so much indoctrination and conditioning to think that something like eternal conscious torment could be compatible with love or justice or mercy. It takes like, moral idiocy. It takes like just sort of a rejection of common sense. And like, if you pursue it further, it just makes less and less and less sense. It actually had, a lot to do with why I deconverted to begin with, because I was sort of led to believe falsely that like this is an essential part of Christianity. Where like, if you reject, an eternal hell for non-believers, then you you might as well just reject half of the other things Christians are supposed to believe as well, because that's just not a serious position. Like annihilationism was like this crazy liberal idea. Like universalism was a bad joke. Like where I grew up, it wasn't even really mentioned. I heard it mentioned like once in passing, like as like an obviously stupid and false thing. And that was like my only exposure to it. So yeah, and then it creates all these other problems. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface. I have several videos.
Let me real quickly. I'll play the devil's advocate or the Christian's advocate here. That all right. So, well, wait a minute. All right, I'm a Christian, let's say, and I have the belief that there is an eternal hell for those who don't accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And I make the claim that, well, hell is just the absence of God, right? And therefore, if God exists, hell is just what happens when you don't have God. And so the eternal conscious torment is that, right? What would you say to sort of that kind of an argument?
So some of the arguments for universalism would kind of preclude that possibility, because if God is this, perfectly good being, and he wants a relationship with you, any sort of rational being who wants what's best for oneself is going to eventually come to see that they should be in a relationship with this being of perfect love and goodness. And the only thing really that could stop that is if you don't really have like infinite chances, because I can see how like in a certain moment someone might reject that, but it would sort of be based on like a lack of understanding. Like, how could they possibly understand what they're rejecting and then still say, yeah, I don't want that? So it must be some kind of lack of understanding on their part. It wouldn't be like how Christopher Hitchens sees it, like submitting to Big Brother or something. We're talking about like a being of perfect love and goodness. So, any rational being would want to be in a relationship with that sort of being. And
it would be unjust to punish someone or to have someone eternally suffering because of their lack of understanding, right? Because of
it's a flaw in yourself that's going to keep you from doing that. Because if you could possibly understand what you were rejecting, then you just wouldn't reject it. If you would still reject it with full understanding of what it is, then you're insane. And I think it's wrong to let insane people torture themselves. So like, it's just, it does seem kind of inevitable. But the conflicts with like mercy and justice and so on, it's like there's nothing you could do where an eternal punishment would be just. Like the imbalance is literally infinite. There's no way that an eternal punishment could be compatible with mercy. It's the least merciful punishment that you could conceive of. So it just seems like if mercy and justice and love and goodness mean literally anything like what we think they mean, then it's just obvious that an eternal punishment, that's not going to be just or merciful or good. And your guilt, it's just never going to make that kind of thing just, because you're a limited being. And there's just there's nothing you could do that would warrant like an infinite punishment. And there's also, you have to factor in that you're limited, that you don't fully understand what a rejection of God like means or entails. Anyway, I just think that if God really wants a relationship with you, then eventually, in the fullness of time, there could be one. And the only way that wouldn't happen is if God just arbitrarily cut things off at some point and said, that's it for you, But, Josh Rasmussen has made this sort of argument, like if we're given infinite chances, then eventually everyone will come to be saved because it's just what's in your rational best interest.
I see.
There's a fine line to be walked here. It's a really, it's a tricky. So obviously, one thing that you hear advocates of eternal conscious torment say is, can you imagine sharing eternal bliss with Hitler? Right? Like anyone who's committed really atrocious crimes in this life. Just makes sense. Say they deserve the exact same reward as someone else, right? All these things, right? So, and I think there's something you can feel a pull there. I mean, there's obviously some issues like are we saying that justice is just retributive or what, right? But I think there's a fine line, and so I've changed my mind a little bit on some of this in the LatterDay Saint position recently. I mean, I think there's a fairly broad range of positions LatterDay Saint can take. I think you can be a pretty strict universalist if you want to be, and I think like. Today, the consensus view seems okay. So the LatterDay Saint position, right, is that there are three kingdoms of heaven: the celestial, the terrestrial, and telestial, and they kind of correspond to different degrees of how good you were in this life, right? And then maybe there's also perdition, right? And it's not clear exactly what qualifies for going there, but we say that the 3 degrees are heaven and perdition is not, but it's not. But anyway, so basically, what I find attractive about this picture, or at least what I would have said, is so like David Paulson, who just died recently, who's a LatterDay Saint philosopher, he criticized John Hick's universalism by saying, if everyone ends up in the exact same place, and that's kind of necessarily true, can we say that all of them are free in some full sense? So I think the way you put it, Emerson, which is a nice way to motivate that position, is if it's what's good for you and you're rational, you're going to choose that eventually, right? If you have infinite choices, that's going to be what you choose. And I'm not sure I agree with that fully. Like, I think it might be practically irrational, but you can be like fully cognitively developed and understand exactly what you're giving up and still choose. Maybe that's just like maybe because I accept libertarian free will, but I think it's probably possible for someone to still reject it. And then if you think that, then it looks kind of tricky to say that you've got this total universalism, right? And so what I find appealing about the LatterDay Saint picture is, on the one hand, it's basically universalist in the sense that my best guess as to what perdition is, this non-heaven king place, is someone who fully understands exactly what they're giving up and they choose to give it up anyway. And maybe again that's like practically rational. Certainly it's not what's best for them, but they have that. That's an option that's available. So no one's free will is abrogated, but it's still universalist in the sense that everyone has the exact same opportunity to get to a kingdom of heaven. Then that looks like it's still. So Joseph Smith, for instance, said something to the effect of, even the lowest kingdom, the celestial kingdom, if you understood how good it was, you'd kill yourself to get there. So it looks like everyone's getting rewarded, right? And so even the really wicked people, right, assuming that someone like Hitler doesn't go to perdition, he gets to get this really great thing. And so that, so on the one hand, it's universal. On the other hand, maybe you still run into problems with that kind of, even though it's tiered, you get rid of the problems of like, is that something that someone like that deserves? And so one thing that I've come to think recently is it's maybe not quite as universalist as I had thought. It's still universal in the sense that no one is going to be suffering in fires of hell for eternity, except maybe the people who fully understand the decision to make it. But I've read recently, it's not the sort of thing I often read in philosophy, but it's Martin Hagelin, at the beginning of Martin Hagelin's book, This Life, where he makes an argument for atheism, actually, saying that what makes life worth living are certain types of finitude, like certain types of pain and caring about things, and you can't care about things if they can't fail, that sort of thing. That's kind of the rough idea of what he's saying. And then he says, well, if heaven is a place where there's just this perfection when you can't have any of these kinds of things that make life worth living, that heaven's not worth living. This is kind of a pragmatic argument against belief in God. And I actually think there's something right there. I think there's a certain kind of conception of perfection that would make life not worth living, right? Not having relationships with people, which I think is a pretty standard part of many Orthodox conceptions of heaven, I think would make that a life not worth living. But I think the Latter-day Saint conception has room for that, right? So like God has relationships with us because he's not simple and impassible, right? And he can have failures in the sense that people he's trying to bring to him can choose to, go to one of the lower kingdoms, let's say. And because Latter-day Saints have such a strong conception of theosis, we're in the same position in the next life as God, where we can have these relationships with beings that we're trying to bring up to be like us and fail. And so you can have these such relationships that make life worth living, right? But if that's right, it may be that kind of care in a really robust sense, like what Hagelin has in mind, is only possible in the highest kingdom. And so then maybe the lower kingdoms don't have lives that are quite as worth living, even though there's still going to be some kind of life worth living there, because it's still a kind of heaven. And so again, it's a very fine line. and this, I'm taking a fairly specific conception of what this afterlife looks like. I think Latter-day Saints, again, have quite a broad range. But if that's right, well, so on the one hand, you get everyone's in heaven, so you get the universalism. On the other, you get some kind of punishment insofar as you don't have quite the fullness of life. And we have, if we accept kind of Hagelin's formulation, we have a fairly specific conception of what that looks like, of why the lower kingdoms aren't just wonderful, or it's all not just really, really nice. There's something missing, but it's still a heaven. So you could you get punishment in the sense of not everyone who did really bad stuff in this life gets to enjoy the kind of fullest flourishing, but on the other hand, it's kind of universal. So anyway, so that's why I think that there's something really appealing about this, is you get to bring together a lot of these judgments or intuitions that we make, and to kind of fit it more or less into one picture, even though it's maybe a slightly more complicated picture than the standard one.
I was going to say real quick, kind of to back up the LDS versus other sort of conceptions of it. I think there's a reframing that a Latter-day Saint can do, and that I personally do when I look at the afterlife, that alters all of this. Because with the traditional sort of Christian conception of like, God is this judge, and you come to him and it's like, he sends you to eternal hell and torment forever, or he sends you to his wonderful kingdom of Disneyland that you get to live in forever and everyone's really happy and dances around, right? That binary view. First of all, that's troubling just because it's so binary, and human beings are not binary. But here's the thing. Latter-day Saints, and I may be wrong on this, so I'm not going to say that I represent all Latter-day Saints, but this is my read of what God is doing. God is not the ex nihilo creator of heaven and hell, who then dictates where you go per se. He's a loving father that exists within reality, and reality itself is what causes you happiness or sadness, joy or well-being or suffering. And what God is trying to do is he's trying to help you to reach the highest level of your potential that you can reach. And we all reach different levels of potential, to where we eventually, because we have free will, or agency as we call it, will, and those are slightly different conceptions, but he's trying to get you as far as you'll go. The torment isn't him tormenting you. That's the other thing, is that I have a belief that, and it's sort of a provisional belief that I'm still sorting out, but I hypothesize that God doesn't actually really punish anyone. It's us, that we choose consequences that harm us, and that God is trying his best to help us to avoid the consequences of choosing things that we should not choose. But we are not, I also would argue that we're not purely rational creatures. I believe human beings actually want things other than God, and we choose things other than God because somewhere deep in our souls, that's what we want. We just don't want him. And the great battle that goes on within the human soul is, what are we going to choose, right? And so the kingdoms of glory are a description of the different levels of glory and life to which we can obtain, with the highest life or way of being in the cosmos is to have a life like that of God, which is the highest level possible. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think that's actually that dovetails quite nicely with like an Aristotelian conception of kind of the relationship between flourish, like moral goodness and happiness, right? So like on Aristotle's view, right, kinds like a humankind has an essence, have essences, and the essences determine what their teloi are, these ends, and fulfilling the end is what's good for you, and it also makes you happy, right? So it's this teleology, right? So you have a certain end that's based on your constitution as a kind,
a measure of your creation that you need to fulfill.
Exactly. And so I think this fits really well with that. So that was the standard view, and then Christians early on adopted something similar. They kind of incorporated that into their framework. But for Aristotle, these kinds are eternal, right? They're not created out of nothing, and so the tie between the happiness and the kind of flourishing goodness is really, really close. For Christians, then, when they had this creation ex nihilo, you have to kind of depend on God putting the happiness and the flourishing kind of together, right? And moral goodness and happiness becoming together is almost like a contingent relationship, whereas for Aristotle it was necessary. And for LatterDay Saints, because we don't believe in a creation ex nihilo, I think you get this back. You get this really thoroughly, or you can have this really thoroughly Aristotelian conception where we have a certain constitution, just that's the way it is. God didn't make us this way, more or less, right? Kind of a fundamental nature. And so we have this telos, we have this certain end that determines what our flourishing looks like. And so, yeah, I think that's absolutely. I think that the way you described it is the way I think of it is reality in some sense, right? I mean, this is just the way we are. God didn't make us have these certain ends be what's good for us, but He's trying to help. He says, "Get there. I'll do what I can to help you get there." That's kind of the loving, bring you to heaven element. And if you don't get there, then you're just going to suffer as a result of the fact that happiness is tied to flourishing, and flourishing is tied to your constitution as a kind. Right? So I mean, yeah, I think the picture you paint fits really nicely with that kind of Aristotelian conception.
And that picture of growth and personal evolution and development, it almost makes more sense if that's what God did himself. And like He's helping us do the thing that He went through, like a more literal sense of a father. Anyway, preview of things to come, of discussion too that's coming. But just fun. On the afterlife, on the afterlife point, something I said before I really knew anything about Mormonism. So it's on the record, I couldn't pretend that I didn't say it. I was like, look, it would make a lot more sense if the afterlife wasn't so binary. Like, it's just so crazy. There's this place of like eternal torment, like this maximal suffering, oh, the doors are locked from the inside. Yeah, whatever. Like, as if people wouldn't, whatever you want to justify it, however you want to justify it. The point is there are only these two places to go. And it's like, why are there no gradients? Because like you say, people are not binary. Like it doesn't make any sense that there are just these two sorting bins basically. And then people try to say, oh, there are these levels to heaven. And it's just, it just seems so like, it seems so ad hoc. And it's like, at the end of the day, for most Christians, it's still just these two places, And then I was like, look, if God were real, why wouldn't He make these different like sort of levels of the afterlife? Like if we were not great, why couldn't we just continue to live in something that's kind of like Earth, And then, I learned more about the Mormon view, and it's like there are literally these like gradients to the afterlife where, it's basically exactly what I was saying, where I was just like, well, if the Christian God was really real, maybe this is how things would be. And then it's like, oh, that's exactly the,
well,
the Mormon
I
view.
think to some extent.